Hello there and thanks for joining me. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use the custom brushes that I created for Corel Painter in August 2017. First is a thick paint brush called Thick Palette Knife. Ideally, you'd want to be using the Wacom Art Pen so that you can use a rotation, meaning that if I have my pen this way I can do a wide mark, but if I rotate it 90 degrees, then I have a thinner mark. I can make these nice diagonal shapes and get a lot of expression out of the brush. So this brush could be really useful for painting tree trunks, for example. I'll have my brush angled with that thin angle, and then if I want a wider angle for the trunk, I can just rotate it. I can go in between those different angles to build up tree trunks here that have a lot of nice texture to them. If you want to control the thickness of the paint, simply double click next to the layer here, and you can decrease or increase the amount. So if I want to flatten out the paint, I'll decrease the amount. Now my paint's flatter, and I can at any time change that as long as this is a thick paint layer. So now it's very flat. You really can't see any paint texture at all. I could do the extreme on the other end, and now there's a lot of texture. So I could get a really nice, rugged looking tree trunk here. If you want, you can also blend other colors into it. You can see I can blend in a little bit of another color here. Let's try a more extreme color so we can really see the difference. You can see the paint is still kind of wet since it's still a thick paint layer. If you wanted to dry the paint, essentially what you would do is just create a new thick paint layer. And then when you're painting, you're getting dry paint on top of that. So this could be leaves or whatever you want. We'll go ahead and just delete these thick paint layers. And when you paint with this brush, it's going to automatically create a thick paint layer because it's a thick paint brush. And one of the coolest things about this brush is it can use multiple colors. So we want to look in our mixer. That can be found under Window. I have mine in a custom palette drawer here. And if I want to, I can click this little sample multiple colors target. I can increase or decrease the size of the sample. So I'll just click right here, right in the center between this red, orange, and then the two darker colors. And now if I paint, I'm getting multiple colors loaded on my brush at once. And so I can have a color that has a little more life to it, that's a little more blended up. Or I can have something like this, where maybe this is a tree trunk or something that's supposed to look three-dimensional and there's a shadow side and a highlight side. I'm going to go ahead and just clear this palette and make my own palette. We can restore the default palette at any time if we want to. I'm going to put down some black by clicking on the black swatch. I'll select my brush to apply the color. Then I'll go ahead and sample this gray color, and I'll put down some of that. And then we'll select the mix color, just to mix that together a little bit. And then we can go ahead and sample. We'll just sample right here where there's a few colors all together. Now if we paint, we can get something that might look like stones. Now depending on the direction that you paint with your brush, and depending on where it's rotated, you might get a highlight on one side, but if you rotate the brush 180, then the highlight's on the opposite side. So you might find that if you can get the right angle, then you can make stones really easily, like so, and then the highlight's on the proper side and the shadows on the proper side. If you wanted to add some brown to those stones, you could simply just select the brownish color that you want, select your apply color, put in a little bit of that brown, and then you go back to sample multiple colors, sample that color, and now you have brownish stones. Now if you want to get that default mixer back, just click on the top right sub-dialog and choose Restore Default Mixer. The next brush that we'll look at is also a thick paint brush, and it's called Thick Sponge. You can select it here. Now you can get a lot of different textures with Thick Sponge depending on the paper texture that you select. So let's select small dots here. We'll increase the size of the paper texture. Now you don't want to make this brush too big, otherwise it'll be a little bit laggy because it is a particle brush. But you can see I can build up this nice texture here. Now it looks a little weird with the dots, so let's change it to something else, maybe pebble board. Now you can see that I get a completely different texture, but it has thickness to it and it can build up on itself so you don't get the same static texture. And we can of course increase the scale of the paint to make it a bit thicker, and we get a more obvious texture. We can build up textures on themselves by selecting multiple textures here, or multiple paper grain settings. And even though we're getting this texture, it's still thick paint, so we can still add to it. We could put in other colors and blend them in. Or we could select other thick paint brushes, such as broken paint, and we could scrape it away and build it up and still interact with it as if it's actually paint on the canvas. We'll go ahead and go back to the thick sponge, and I can put my texture back in, so you can get a lot of really neat textured effects with this brush. The next brush that we'll look at is technically not a brush, it is an image hose nozzle. It's called Flowers Lavender, and it's found in the nature category of my image hose nozzles. Now, most image hose nozzles will recommend which image hose brush you need to use. You have to use an image hose brush in order to paint with the nozzle. So it wants us to choose linear size P. We'll choose that. You can see an example of how you might use this brush, but I'll just show you how to paint with it. I'll create a new layer. And if I paint, you can see that I can make lavender. Now, if we press lighter, the lavender is smaller. If we press harder, then it starts to get bigger until it reaches the maximum diameter of our brush. So if we want really big lavender, we make our brush really big. And there you go, you get lavender that's closer to the foreground. So you might start by adding some lavender in the background here. We'll go to Effects, Focus, Soften. And we'll soften it up so it looks more distant. We'll create another layer in front of that. We'll make sure that our brush is bigger now overall. We'll paint in another layer. We'll go ahead and use that same soften effect, except this time we'll soften it less because it's closer to the foreground. Add another layer. Make our brush even bigger. We can see it's at 400 now, so let's change it to 600. And we'll paint, and now you can see that we have this nice effect of distance. And the last brush we'll look at is also an image hose nozzle. It's right next to lavender here. It's called Thick Foliage. Here's an example of what can be done with it. It can create some kind of spongy, oily paint effects. So it makes nice painterly leaves that don't look too realistic or too precise. I'll go ahead and create a new layer, and it wants us to choose linear size P angle D. So I will choose that. I'll make my brush the size of the foliage that I want. And then if I press hard, I can get big foliage. If I press lightly, I can get thin little foliage that looks more like bushes. So what you would want to do is just kind of build up trees like this. Then you can have your foliage kind of go in a direction by pulling in a direction too, if you want it to have kind of a hanging effect like this. If you use kind of a thinner, smaller brush, you could make some little hedges like so. If you wanted to make like a maze or a garden or something. You can also use it for grass. Just use lighter pressure in the background and then firmer pressure as you move into the foreground. If you want to change the color of the foliage, you can do that in a couple of different ways. One is to select the color version of linear size P angle D, and then click on your additional color here, and then choose the color that you want. Let's say we want it to be a little bit more yellow like this. Now if we paint, we can get yellow foliage. Now the color tends to overwhelm the contrast in the piece, which doesn't look good. So for this particular brush, it's probably better to do it a different way. Another way that you could do it is just go back to the regular linear size P angle D brush. You could make your foliage here, and then you could simply go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors, and then just adjust the hue to whatever you want. If you want it to be a different color of leaves, you could even pump up the saturation if you want it to be brighter, and you can make it darker or lighter if you prefer. So there you go, that's a demonstration of the 4 custom brushes I created for Corel Painter in August 2017. You can download these brushes right now on my website at aaronrutten.com. There's a link in the video description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.